And welcome to this CIWEM Scottish Branch webinar. My name is Alice Gent, the chair of the CIWEM Scottish Branch, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all today, particularly with such lovely weather outside. To continue our programme of online events, I'm delighted to welcome Elaine Fotheringham, who will be presenting this evening. Elaine has been a Senior Planning Officer at SEPA since 2016, and she has the responsibility for how the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act is implemented through SEPA's role as statutory consultee in the land use planning process. She's a geography graduate of the University of Edinburgh and holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning. And she's also a chartered member of the Royal Town Planning Institute and has worked in the field of land use planning since 2008. We're going to have a question and answer session after the presentation, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to post any questions to Elaine, and we'll aim to work through as many as possible. Right, thank you very much, Elaine. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to speak to you this evening. And to everyone who's joined the webinar, I think we've got about 100 people online, which is great, but also extremely daunting, given that this is my first ever webinar, so please do bear with me. I plan to speak for about 35-40 minutes, after which we'll have some time for questions, and I'll be joined by my SEPA colleague, Fiona McClay, who was also involved in producing the guidance. So why have I been invited to speak to you this evening? Well, as said in the introduction, I'm Elaine Fotheringham. I'm a Senior Planning Officer at the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, or SEPA for short. I'm responsible for how we deliver Scotland's Flood Risk Management Act through our role in the land use planning system. A key part of what we do in this role is produce guidance to assist planners, land use planners, in understanding how flooding might impact upon built development. So I've been asked to talk to you this evening about one piece of guidance that we published last year, and this sets out allowances for climate change that should be applied in flood risk assessments. The aim of the guidance was to develop something that would lead to the creation of new places in Scotland that are resilient to climate change. We knew that we needed to update our guidance, I think back in 2016, so it took us quite a while to get to the stage of having this new guidance produced and published. I'll just give you a bit of background that should be useful for the rest of the webinar. So I mentioned before that we've got a role at SEPA within the land use planning process. We are in fact a statutory consultee, and there are regulations that planning authorities must consult with us when they deem that a planning application is likely to result in a material increase in the number of properties at risk of flooding. Developers are usually then required to produce a flood risk assessment to better understand the flood risk on a particular site, which we will then review as part of our response to the consultation, and we'll provide that in a response back to the planning authority. We had recommended for some time that an allowance of 20% be applied to flood risk assessments to take account of the likely effects of climate change on flood risk. By allowance for climate change, we mean a prediction of the anticipated change in peak river flow, peak rainfall intensity, or sea level rise caused by future climate change. And this allowance can be factored into flood risk assessments. So these are some of the key things probably to emphasise about the guidance. Firstly, producing it was quite a big step forward for SEPA. It supersedes the previous 20%, as I said, which we knew for some time was based on out-of-date science. We can now say that our guidance is based on the best science that's available to us, and I'll say a bit more about that later on. It also has a Scotland-specific focus, so the 20% allowance was an allowance that was widely used, as some of you will know, throughout the UK in the past, but this guidance is specific to Scotland. It's regionally varying, and in some parts of Scotland it results in a significant difference relative to the previous 20%. It also provides different allowances for river, coastal and surface water flooding. One other important thing to note is that the guidance is very much intended for land use planning purposes and takes a precautionary approach as a result. So those of you that are involved in other aspects of flood risk management may wish to look at a broader range of climate projections that are more reflective of the managed adaptive approach, and we can maybe touch on some of that in the questions if anyone wants to discuss that a bit further. So what was the impetus for us producing the new guidance? Well, hopefully preaching to the choir with this one, but our planet is warming and the fact is inescapable. So here we have a very poignant visual of the Australian bushfires of 2019. Here we have a satellite image showing Arctic sea ice extents back in 1979. When you compare that with the extents last year, the difference is quite stark. I'll just flick back between those two. Sorry. Yeah, so you can see quite a marked change there. So our planet is warming and our climate is changing. I'll just go through some of the sort of facts that are relevant to the guidance and where it's come from. So human activities are estimated to have caused about 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels, and global warming is likely to reach about 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052. NASA and the UK Met Office have found the 10 years to the end of 2019 to have been the warmest decade on record. 2019 was the second warmest year in a record that dates back to 1850. 9 of the 10 warmest years on record have occurred since 2005. The warmest 20 years in UK records have occurred since 1995, and the warmest 5 of those 20 have taken place in the last decade. So the stripy lines across the top of the slide are ones that some of you might be quite familiar with, but they're from Ed Hawkins of the University of Reading. And each stripe represents the temperature of a single year across the range of warming that's taken place, so just over 1 degree so far of global warming. And it's quite an effective visual representation of what we're dealing with here, and it particularly highlights the warming of the most recent past in particular. We're already locked into some future warming because of the emissions that are out in the atmosphere just now, regardless of what we did yesterday or today. And even under the most conservative emissions scenario for the future, UK annual temperature is projected to rise further. The graph on the right of this screen shows annual temperature projections for Scotland across high, medium and low emissions pathways. And all of these show warming taking place in the future compared to today, but just at differing levels. So one thing to note is that the low emissions scenario is the one that is most closely aligned to keeping us within the terms of the Paris Agreement, the 2015 Paris Agreement, which sets the global goal to keep the increase in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to keep it to 1.5 degrees. So this means that temperatures in Scotland will rise in future, even if we keep to below 2 degrees of warming, which is quite interesting. So in Scotland, temperature in the 2000s was about 0.9 of a degree warmer than the 61 to 1990 average. And this graph from the Met Office shows a gradual upwards trend in mean annual temperatures in Scotland up to the present day. This slide shows annual rainfall, which has increased by about 11% over the past century. And again, this graph shows an upwards trend in annual rainfall in the most recent past. This slide relates to sea level rise, which is obviously another key consequence of a warming climate. Sea level records from Aberdeen show a rise of about 8 centimetres between 1900 and 1990, and sea level will continue to rise beyond the end of the 21st century, even if global temperatures do stay below 2 degrees C. So even if we manage to keep to the Paris Agreement, sea level will continue to rise beyond the end of this century. Changes in sea level are driven by the thermal expansion of the ocean, as well as the addition of water through global ice melt. And within Scotland, as many of you will know, the impacts are offset to some extent by glacial isostatic rebound, which is the rise of land that was formerly under the weight of the ice sheets that were around during the last ice age. Isostatic rebound is one of the key drivers for the differences in the rate of cumulative rise that are set out in the guidance, and you'll see that in just a second. However, all areas of Scotland show a net sea level rise in future. If emissions continue to rise, then we could see nearly 1 metre of sea level rise between now and the end of this century, which will obviously have significant implications for coastal areas, low-lying coastal areas and flooding. So what information and science did we base the guidance upon? The guidance is based on the UK CP projections, so both the 2009 and the 2018 projections, and I'll say a wee bit more about that in more detail in just a second. These consider 3 alternative pathways for levels of greenhouse gas emissions: high, medium and low. As we speak this evening, global pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are in line with the medium emissions scenario. However, we took the decision to base the guidance upon the high emissions scenario, or RCP 8.5 as climate scientists might describe it. And this assumes limited efforts to mitigate climate change so that greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere will continue to rise. And the high emission scenario is often described as a business as usual scenario. So it's a projection forward of where we are really at the moment. We took this approach because whilst we acknowledge that obviously the Paris Agreement is there, it commits the international community to keeping global temperature to well below 2 degrees. And obviously in Scotland in particular, we've got the commitment, we're fully committed to keeping to the Paris Agreement. The Scottish Government's extremely clear on that. And we've got domestic targets to get to net zero by 2045. We know, in spite of that, that the emissions of other countries that are signed up to Paris suggest that we're likely to be on a higher emissions pathway at the moment. So given the current concentrations of greenhouse gases and the trend of annual increases over the last decade, it's likely that concentrations will reach the level that will exceed 1.5 degrees of warming in between 3 and 13 years, and 2 degrees in roughly between 15 and 30 years, and that's according to the European Environment Agency. So we can't be confident, therefore, that the global response to the climate emergency that we're all facing will really be sufficient to avoid dangerous levels of climate change, which is why we've taken this precautionary approach for this land use planning guidance. So here are a few images that don't give us a great cause for optimism, I would say. This is an extract of the carbon dioxide concentrations taken at the Mauna Loa Observatory. CO2 in the atmosphere in parts per million, and it just shows obviously that the trend is ever upwards. At the moment, this is accurate as of June the 19th, so not a great deal of reason for positivity there about reducing your emissions as things stand at the moment. And these are just some recent headlines that reflect that. It's becoming quite a regular thing now that you see headlines referring to greenhouse gas concentration records being broken again and again. And that was certainly the case at the end of last year. So using the high emissions scenario, as I said, is an appropriately precautionary approach, we think, for land use planning guidance, because this guidance will be used to inform decisions that, by their very nature, land use planning decisions have pretty long-term consequences. So something that's approved today might be built next year, or possibly not next year now, given where we are with COVID, but in normal times that might have been the case, and then the development is on the ground for a long period of time after that. So decisions that are taken in the land use planning sphere are ones that can be very long lasting. So it's important to take that precautionary approach, because it avoids locking us into a future where the developments that are built today end up being at risk in the future because of a lack of action to cut global greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll now go on to explain a little bit more about the data behind each of the allowances in turn. So firstly, looking at the fluvial flooding allowances. So as I mentioned, the guidance is based on UKCP information, both 2009 and 2018. These don't provide projections for high river flows, but they do provide probabilistic projections for daily precipitation and temperature. So from this, we know that for most of Scotland, winters are likely to be wetter in future and summers are likely to be drier, although there will be variations across Scotland. Shortly after the UK projections were published in 2009, we commissioned the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to take them and use them to assess the vulnerability of Scottish river catchments to climate change. And the link to this study is provided on the slide that's on the screen just now. The allowances that are in the guidance for fluvial flooding are based on the findings of this study and are provided for the 12 river basin regions in Scotland, and I'll show you those in just a second. So, as mentioned before, the allowances are based on the high emissions scenario, and we've used the 67th percentile, which you can see on the screen here. 67th is the one that is considered unlikely to be exceeded. So it's the point at which about 67 of the possible scenarios fall below that threshold and 33% fall above it. So the chart that's on the screen just now shows an extract of the CEH study for the Clyde River Basin region, and the correct allowance is circled in red, which in this case would be 44% increase in peak flows. So I'll show you what some of this looks like in mapped form for the fluvial allowances towards the end. One thing just to add is that many of you will be aware that we now have the 2018 UK climate projections. The guidance is based on 2009 ones at the moment, but work is currently underway to produce new flow projections from these. And again, I'll say a wee bit more about that towards the end. So these are the 12 allowances in the guidance for peak river flows for the river basin regions, the 12 river basin regions. You'll see that there is some significant difference between these and the previous allowance that we recommended, particularly in the north and west of Scotland, which is possibly what you might expect. The allowances for coastal flooding are again based on the high emissions scenario, but unlike the fluvial allowances, they're based upon the 95th percentile from UKCP 18 this time, sea level rise projections to the end of this century. This level of sea level rise is very unlikely to be exceeded by 2100, but under all emissions scenarios, sea level rise does continue beyond the end of this century. And in a business as usual scenario, so high emissions, the 95th percentile for 2100 is lower than the 50th percentile by 2150. So that's really what's been shown in this diagram here that's on the screen just now. So therefore, if we'd used the 50th percentile of the UK sea level rise estimates, it wouldn't have allowed for any uncertainty in terms of the lifespan of development, and that we're probably particularly thinking about significant infrastructure projects at the coast. In addition to this, there are emerging uncertainties about future rates of global sea level rise, particularly with regard to the contribution from the Antarctic ice sheets, which are not fully accounted for in the UKCP 18 projections. And again, I'll say a bit more about that just shortly. So the rate of sea level rise, which you'll see varies around Scotland, and this is related to isostatic rebound that I mentioned before. You can see that sea level rise is taking place fastest in places such as Shetland and the Western Isles, which were furthest from the centre of the ice sheet. So that's what's shown here. So these are the allowances themselves. We decided to regionalise those by river basin region too, because there was found to be quite a minimal change in the projections when they were broken up across river basin regions. So that's the reason why we've taken the same approach to the coastal allowances, that they fit with the approach to the peak flows using the river basin regions. Once again, you'll see they set out quite significant increases in sea level rise predicted for the end of the century, ranging from about 0.85 metres in the Clyde region to over 1 metre in Shetland. And I should just add at this point that any sites that are expected to be sensitive to changes in the offshore wave climate, we recommend in the guidance that you carry out a sensitivity test of between 10 and 20% increase in extreme offshore wave heights. You can apply that on the range of changes in offshore wave climate that are in the UKCP 18 marine report. There's more information on that in the guidance itself. So I mentioned earlier about emerging uncertainty in terms of future sea level rise. So there is scientific uncertainty about the contribution of land ice melt, particularly regarding the potential collapse of the West Antarctic ice sheet. And we can't really quantify that uncertainty yet, so it's not included in the projections that are used for the allowances that are in our guidance, and neither is it included in the underlying projections that came out of the IPCC's fifth assessment report. So, there has been a more recent special report from the IPCC, which some of you may have seen, on the ocean and the cryosphere. And that highlighted that we can't really rule out an increase in global sea level by 2 metres by 2100. So the UKCP marine report also notes that discharge from the West Antarctic ice sheet could lead to substantial additional sea level rise beyond the range given in the UK CP18 projections, and recommends that users also consider a high-end scenario. And the special report recommends that stakeholders that have a low risk tolerance, so for example, those that are planning for coastal safety in cities and long-term investment in critical infrastructure, and by that, I guess we should be thinking about land use planners, they should consider global sea level rise above the 0.6 to 1.1 metre range considered likely for 2100. So I suppose what this goes to show is that there is an unquantifiable risk both that the amount of sea level rise by 2100 could be greater than in our guidance says it will be at present, and also that sea level rise happens or might happen more quickly than they may expect. So this is obviously something that we need to be alert to, and it does provide us with a bit of further justification as to why we've taken the approach in the guidance that we have to the sea level rise allowances. The next allowances are for surface water flooding. So as we know, obviously warmer air can hold more water vapour, and that means that as the climate warms, future rainfall might become more intense, and that would be true for Scotland even if we see warmer summers, warmer and drier summers as a whole. The allowances in the guidance at the moment are based on the UCWR rainfall intensity for sewer design 2017 study. They're only based on a single model run, and the study can't provide probabilistic estimates, and it only gives a central or best guess estimate as well as an upper limit for some sensitivity testing. So the allowance in the guidance is based on the high emissions scenario central estimate from that UCWR study. The allowances here are presented on an east-west split across Scotland, and those east-west groupings are based on the smaller river basin region groupings. So those have been aggregated and then split across the country. Again, the allowances that you can see on screen just now are quite large. There is more detail on the guidance about when these allowances should be used for small river catchments instead or in place of the peak river flow allowances, and we can say a bit more about that at the end if that would be helpful. So next I'll show you some of the visuals of what the allowances for fluvial flooding actually look like in mapped form. And one thing just to stress at this point is that the allowances that are in our guidance that we're talking about tonight are not reflected in our current SEPA flood maps that some of you might be familiar with using that are on our website. But future versions of the maps should reflect these allowances, but they don't at the moment. So just to stress that point. So for some areas, this is obviously just looking at the fluvial allowances, but for some areas, the allowances make a difference to the extent of flooding. For other areas, it's only when you look at the change in depth that you see the full consequence. So the kind of practical planning implications of this are obviously that an increase in flood extents reduces the amount of potentially flood risk free land in Scotland, and an increase in depth levels obviously increases the severity of flooding to receptors that are already known to be at risk of flooding potentially. So the variation in the impacts is related to the topography of river channels, depending on which one you're looking at, whether the topography means that the water is contained and therefore depths would increase, or whether the surrounding land is relatively flat, allowing for higher levels to spill into the wider area. So this example is one that's taken from the River Tweed near Kelso, and it shows a visible increase in the flood extent from the 200, which is the blue, our 1 in 200 year flood event, to the 1 in 200 year plus climate change, which is shown in yellow, which hopefully everyone can see reasonably clearly. It's probably not a great distinction, but hopefully you can see it. And what you can see there is obviously there's quite a significant increase in flood extents between those two data sets. That's with a 33% allowance for climate change, which would be recommended by the guidance. So this is another example showing peak river flow on the River Erne near Perth. And again, the blue is as per existing, and the yellow is with the inclusion of a climate change allowance of 35% in this case. So here, the yellow area is obviously less visible. The blue is as existing, the yellow is with the inclusion of that allowance of 35%. So you can see there's quite a limited change in the flood extent. However, the next two slides show more of a significant change when you look at the depths that are involved in the changes here. So this is the 200-year, the 1 in 200-year event, which we think of as the functional floodplain in land use planning. Hopefully you can see the depths that are being presented here. So you've got less than 3 metre or 0.3 of a metre, 0.3 of a metre to 1 metre, and greater than 1 metre depth. So this is as per the 1 in 200, and then when you contrast that with the application of the climate change allowance, and I'll just flick between those two, you can see that in the western portion of the map there's quite a significant change in depth, and there's a lot more areas that fall into the plus 1 metre depth band. In the eastern half of the map, the depth bands don't change quite as much from one scenario to the other, but obviously the changes can still be quite significant here, because you're talking about depths that are already greater than 1 metre, which, you know, if you're being flooded by that level of floodwater, then that's pretty significant. So it is a significant change. So what does all of this mean? This is the bit that's of interest to me as a land use planner. Here on the slide, we've got some of the kind of practical implications of what global warming and climate change might mean for us in Scotland. So we've got nicer weather, potentially maybe drier weather in the summer, but would you want to live somewhere like this in the end of the 21st century? So the places that we're building now really need to be places that people want to, but also can live in at the end of this century. If we plan for future climate change now, it allows for a reduction in the risks that are associated with long-term investment, and by that we mean investment that's made in built development, which can be really significant. Our 2018 National Flood Risk Assessment identified around 284,000 properties that are at medium to high risk of flooding in Scotland, and by the 2080s, we predict that this will increase by about 110,000 properties, and that's solely due to the impact of climate change on flooding. So the notable aspect of that is that the figures don't include properties, or they only include properties that are on the ground in 2018, or that were on the ground in 2018, and these figures don't take account of new development that's yet to take place. So these are obviously totals that we don't want to avoid, or we don't want to add to through future built development, and the guidance should play a part in helping with that. At the present time, the guidance is a recommendation. So when we are consulted, as I explained at the start, on planning applications, we don't seek to object if that was something that we're looking to do based on a proposal that we're being consulted on. We wouldn't use these allowances as a basis for objection. They are recommendations, so they're best practice, and we encourage their use. And what we hope is that planning authorities will take them and embed them in their development plans, their local development plans, which are the sort of land use planning frameworks that cover the whole of Scotland. And we think that some local authorities are beginning to do that. So far, we don't have any evidence to suggest that the guidance is causing any difficulties for development, which was obviously something that we were, quite alert to at the time we were developing the guidance, because, as I said at the start, or just shortly ago, if you're increasing the extent, then obviously that has implications for the amount of land that's available, that's flood risk free for development. So that was a consideration when we were producing the guidance. But equally, it's important that our advice is based on the most up-to-date science and information. So that has to be the kind of overriding principle that guides us. As things stand at the moment, the functional floodplain in Scotland is the 1 in 200 year event. That's what's specified in Scottish planning policy, which is the national planning document that guides us at the moment. So that remains unchanged. However, some of you might be aware at the moment that national planning policy in Scotland is being reviewed as a consequence of the new Planning Act that was taken through Parliament last year. So we now have a new Planning Act in Scotland, which is in the process of being gradually enacted through various bits of secondary legislation that are due to come forward in the coming years. And one of the consequences of that is that there's provision now for the Scottish Government to produce a statutory planning policy statement for Scotland. So at the moment, national planning policy, it's produced by government, but it's non-statutory. So it has some weight in decision making, but ultimately just now decisions that planners take on planning applications should be made in accordance with their own local development plan, which obviously will take heed of what SPP says, but SPP doesn't have a statutory weight. So that is something that will change as a consequence of the new Planning Act. So the government at the moment has started engagement, public engagement on MPF4, as it will now be called. So SPP will go and will have an update to National Planning Framework 3, which is a document that's been around for a while, and that will subsume SPP and will also provide some of the spatial components that are in the current MPF3. So our guidance that we have that we're talking about tonight is obviously something that we are discussing with the Scottish Government at this point in time, given that this is an opportunity for national policy to be reviewed in this area. So it's something that we're obviously discussing quite keenly with the Scottish Government. What we do know, I suppose, is that the very best, so thinking about development, the very best development, so the most valuable, the most livable, the most desirable development that we do now, that we undertake today, should be flood-free just now, but should also be flood-free in 2050 and at the end of this century. So what's next for the guidance? Well, we're committed to keeping it up to date as and when new information emerges. I think I've already said that. And we do expect to make 2 updates, both this year and next year. And I'll just explain a bit about those. So the first is an update to peak river flows that we hope to be able to make this year. So as I said before, the peak flows are based on UKCP09. Again, we've commissioned CEH to take the 2018 climate projections for the UK and translate those into peak river flows. So the commission of this work was actually done, it was done by the Environment Agency as part of a joint research project with Natural Resources Wales and DEFRA. And that work has overlaid regional rainfall projections onto the modelled flood response surfaces to provide probabilistic impact on flood peaks for any 1 kilometre river grid cell that has a catchment, or that's within a catchment of 100 kilometres squared or more. And what you can see on the screen here is a screen grab of a web viewer that's been developed to display the information that's come out of the CEH work. And this will be in a public facing version. It's not currently available, and the study itself is yet to be published, but we are in a position at the moment within SEPA where an Environment Agency are doing the same as well as with other devolved administrations. We're considering how we'll use this to update our guidance. So we need to do some focused engagement with key stakeholders on this in the coming months. One of the key things that we need to think about and come to a decision upon is the scale at which we should present the new allowances, because there are some methodological differences in how each set of the allowances was derived. So between the 2011 CEH study and the one that's on the screen just now. So we're currently weighing up whether we can present new information in a river basin region format which would fit with our current guidance, but there are quite a number of issues that we need to consider and work through in consultation with primarily people who will use the guidance, and we'll be doing that just shortly. One key thing that we can share that's come out of the study, as I said, it's not published yet, but one key thing that we can share tonight is just that there are greater changes and uplifts in the east of Scotland compared to the west. So that's something that's new and will be reflected when we update the guidance. The second update to note relates to rainfall uplifts. So we're currently awaiting updated information on these from the Future Drainage Project that's been undertaken by Newcastle University at the moment. And we believe that these outputs will be available early next year, so into 2021. And we'll update the guidance as soon as we can after that. There is actually, coincidentally, there was a webinar which some of you may have also dialed into today on this very subject. The link to the place where those webinars are saved is on the screen. I believe that it was recorded and the link to that will be provided soon on that webpage. So if you're interested and you weren't able to make the webinar earlier today, then you might want to do that following this link. So again, once we have that information, that will be something we'll look to use to update our guidance as well. Okay, so you'll be glad to know that this is the last slide from me. There's a link to the guidance itself, as well as my contact details. I'm also happy to take any questions at the appropriate time, in tandem with Fiona McClay, who's one of the SEPA scientists who was involved in producing the guidance alongside myself. She's on the line just now and is going to join us for the question session. So I think all I need to say now is just thanks for listening, and I'll hand things back over to the chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. Really appreciate that presentation. Very informative and obviously a very timely topic as well. Thank you again for giving up your time. So yeah, as Elaine says, if other people have questions as well, if you just want to use the Q&A function in Zoom, or else I see a couple of people pop things in the chat as well, no problem either way. So the first question, Fiona and Elaine, that we've got here is, do you believe the ambitious net zero carbon 2030 is doable practically?
I think that might be a question more for Fiona than me, but might one that Fiona struggles to answer as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really difficult question, but in terms of developing guidance, I'm not sure that it really matters. So I think as long as we know that any reduction in emissions that we make is going to reduce what we have to adapt to. But I think, as Elaine was explaining, what we've done in developing the guidance and choosing which emission scenario to use for that is make sure we're choosing one that doesn't assume that the world's going to take action which it may or may not do.
Okay, brilliant. So next question then is on a bit more focused on the guidance. Would you say that this guidance is more so geared towards new developments and future-proofing than things such as flood studies and surface water management plans, realising that maybe potentially these large allowances may not make a scheme viable or technically feasible? Is there any kind of wiggle room in those kind of elements?
I can maybe have a go answering that one first. Fiona might want to come in after, but yeah, so I think I said at the start that the guidance it is primarily aimed at a land use planning audience because of the approach that it takes, the precautionary approach. But we do acknowledge that there are likely to be other allowances that will need to be considered for other aspects of flood risk management, one of those being flood protection schemes. And obviously at the moment there is guidance, and we do try to promote taking a managed adaptive approach to flood protection schemes in particular. There was some research that was published, I think, by Climate Exchange earlier this year on that, which Fiona might want to say a bit more about. But yeah, definitely we do recognise that this guidance as it stands is very much tailored towards taking a precautionary approach to development that's, will be on the ground for a long time and probably isn't very capable of being adapted over its lifespan as well, which is different to flood protection schemes potentially. Fiona?
Yeah, I think it's important to note as well that with flood protection schemes, maybe there are adverse consequences of building them too big if you build them for a level of climate change which doesn't actually happen. So I think what we're trying to encourage with flood protection schemes is that people take a more adaptive approach and maybe consider a wider range of actions rather than just say, well, we want a 1 in 200 year wall plus climate change, and think about when you might need to build that wall bigger if you do, and when you might know whether you need to do it. But yeah, it's worthwhile having a look at the Climate Exchange report on taking a managed adaptive approach to flood risk management in Scotland, and that's available from the Climate Exchange website.
Fantastic, thank you. And another question here, should more be done to promote and support resilience for properties at medium to high risk already, and not jump into all-out avoidance as an overarching principle?
Yeah, I think I'll have a go answering that one. Yeah, I think there is a distinction. There is some work that's being undertaken at the moment by the Scottish Government. They produced an action plan, I think towards the end of last year, which is aimed at encouraging uptake of property level protection measures, resistance and resilience measures for existing development. But there is, I suppose that the land use planning guidance is very much related to new built development in the future, but there definitely is a role to play for, look at how we can make existing development that's on the ground now more resistant to flooding in the future as well. And I think that is something that's been actively pursued by the government, and there are a range of work streams I think that are falling out of that action plan to try and take that forward. I think initially it's about building a bit more of an evidence base as to why some of those measures are maybe not being taken up by property owners and occupiers at the moment. But there is certainly a focus on that's coming from government at the moment for existing development that's on the ground.
Okay, brilliant. And one other question here as well. I'm not sure, it may be something that's more kind of Scottish Water focused question, so it may be that you may not be able to answer it, and that's fine. But someone's asked, we sometimes use data for FRAs from Scottish Water integrated catchment models, for example in urban Glasgow, and as far as I'm aware the climate change allowances do not go to 55%. Can you comment on any moves for Scottish Water to align with SEPA recommendations on climate change? Is this maybe something you guys could speak to through your partnership with Scottish Water?
Fiona?
I think the Scottish Water allowances that were used in some of the integrated catchment studies come from a slightly earlier UCWA study. So there were two phases of the study that we used to for our surface water allowances. But we do discuss what our approach is with Scottish Water and also with other stakeholders and infrastructure operators such as Transport Scotland, and we are trying to get alignment where we can, but there might also be reasons why for different purposes you have a different risk appetite and you want to do something else. So not aligning on everything might not always be a problem, but we do try and minimise it.
Brilliant. And another question here, do you think that there are any good examples from other countries that we should be looking to as an example for how we implement this land use planning and precautionary approach?
Yeah, I can have a go at answering that one. I think there are definitely examples elsewhere as to how you can mitigate and also avoid flood risk. Usually European examples that are cited, particularly in relation to things like retreats and relocation. These are some issues that I think we're still kind of grappling with a bit in Scotland. In terms of specifically how other countries utilise information on climate change and their flood risk assessments, I'll be honest and say that I'm not sure about that. Fiona might have some information on that, but I think broadly speaking, there are obviously examples about how you manage flood risk through the land use planning process internationally that I think we can learn things from. Fiona?
I don't really have anything to add on that, I'm afraid, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Brilliant. Another question here. How do the presenters respond to the level of acceptance of the repeated message of climate change that we are not doing enough to adapt? I think that's the Committee on Climate Change findings that they're referring to.
Fiona, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I think all we can do working in flood risk management is to provide the tools and the guidance to help others do enough to adapt, and I think that's what we're trying to do with guidance like that. And I think in setting some of our allowances is maybe using higher emission scenarios and choosing them at fairly precautionary levels. I think we'll hope to get there through the planning process, but whether things like investment in flood defences and protection of land for natural flood management and things are there, I think is something that, yeah, we probably do need to work on in Scotland as a whole.
Brilliant, thank you, Fiona. And the last couple of questions here. Is SEPA planning and updating flood defences to reflect these predicted increases in river flows?
I'll answer that one, Aisling. So in Scotland, responsibility for flood defences rests with local authorities. But so it's not, we wouldn't, SEPA itself wouldn't decide to make flood defences larger as a result of climate projections. But what might happen is that areas where there might be significant flood risk with climate change will be picked up in the flood risk management strategies, and then the local flood risk management plans, and then through local authority flood studies. So as we improve our information on how climate change may affect future flood risk, that filters through the whole flood risk management planning process, and yeah, eventually things may get done.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question here around catchment calibration. Are SEPA continuing to work on catchment calibration for smaller catchments in regard to the use of REFH 3.1?
That's definitely one for Fiona.
How we develop our guidance for small catchments is actually one of the main questions regarding the new study which CH have been doing to update the flow uplifts, because it's not actually applicable for catchments smaller than 100 kilometres squared. And the other major step forward will be from small catchments will be the better information on short duration rainfall, which will come out of the Future Drainage Project, which is analysing the local projections. That's the 2.2 kilometre squared projections from UK CP18. So they're able to resolve convective storms, which are obviously going to be quite important for surface water flooding, but also potentially for flashy catchments and small, heavily urbanised catchments. So not specifically with REFH 3.1, because that's software which is owned by, well, it's developed by an external software developer. We will speak to them if we're asking them to have something in their software which will allow rainfall allowances to be implemented. But in terms of what we do with small catchments going forwards, that's yeah, it's a discussion, it's a topic for discussion at the moment, and will be until we get rainfall uplifts from the Future Drainage Project.
Brilliant, thank you. I think this is maybe the last one now. So it kind of speaks to your knowledge of the NPF4. So would the Scottish NPF4 be asking more of renewable energy in the context of flood management solution regarding opportunities for carbon reduction and fossil fuel dependence, for example?
I think that's one for policy colleagues in Scottish Government to answer. My policy background is really flooding. So I think that's possibly something that I can't answer. NPF4 will certainly cover that as a policy area, because the current Scottish planning policy does. But yeah, I mean, I guess the extent to which, you know, what it says about climate change mitigation, that'll be a decision for Scottish Government. Although we do obviously have our targets of getting to net zero by 2045, which we assume will be something that will come through really strongly in NPF4, and certainly the discussions that we've had as SEPA with government on NPF4 so far have indicated that the climate emergency and climate change mitigation will be front and centre in terms of their thinking for NPF4. So I think there's reason to be positive there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Elaine. And just final question now. So given that climate change allowances are probabilistic estimates with an associated distribution, can you say anything regarding SEPA's views on appropriate joint probability approaches for climate change applied to, say, sea level rise and river flow? Obviously, a precautionary approach would be to simply apply the recommended allowances to both. That can result in an overly erroneous provision. Would you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's probably one for me as well. I don't think from the existing joint probability guidance that's used for flood risk management in the UK, so that's the DEFRA EA guidance FD2308, there's much in that that suggests that we'd expect much of the dependence between surge and flow to change with to change with climate change. The sea level rise allowances are a change in mean sea level, so that happens all the time. So that also happens if you've got a negative surge event and it's a neap tide, you still got that increase in mean sea level that everything's happening around. So in terms of joint probability for climate change allowances, I think that's not really, yeah, I think they do both need to be applied to both at the same time. I don't think you can apply them independently. In terms of joint probability guidance in general, I think the Environment Agency have been scoping a project to update the approach for joint probability analysis, and I think that's going to focus on the the sort of UK industry standard approaches for joint probability analysis. I think that's likely to focus on the coast initially, but I'm not sure of the timescales for that.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, both. Right, so if we've got no more questions, then I just want to say thank you very much again for a really interesting presentation. And as Aisling said at the beginning, a very topical one at the moment. So unless anyone's got any other questions, they can send an email to Elaine. If you wouldn't mind putting your email address on the screen for that first slide, Elaine. But otherwise, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.